I'm Dr. Bonnie J. Dunbar, Texas A&M University, and a non-resident fellow, Rice University, public policy here. I'm really honored to be able to introduce Dr. Ronak Shah today. He joined the University of Texas Medical Branch recently as the director of the Aerospace Medicine Division, but he spent 5 years prior to that as the medical director of the NASA Johnson Space Center Clinic. And in that position, he was responsible for both medical and administrative oversight of all clinical services provided on campus. This included flight medicine and occupational medicine clinics, the neutral buoyancy laboratory, medical operations in Moscow and Star City, Russia, the astronaut gym, pharmacy, test subject screening, and the White Sands test facility. He has been integral to both the design and implementation of multiple clinical initiatives, including a medical home model for astronaut healthcare, very important during COVID, the Treat Astronauts Act, advancing support for assisted reproductive technology, laying the foundation for an astronaut autopsy program, and both tracking and reducing healthcare expenses. He's played a major role in JSC's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, leading COVID physicians in a working group and developing risk reduction strategies for launch and landing operations. During his early years at NASA, Dr. Shah also served as the deputy element scientist for the exploration medical capability element in the NASA Human Research Program, where he led a large cross-agency team and was integral in restructuring the element's research portfolio. He's had several honors. He's former president of the Society of NASA Flight Surgeons. He's received the NASA Exceptional Achievement Medal, and he's board certified in aerospace medicine and internal medicine, and holds dual master's degrees in public health and business administration. So Dr. Shah, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dunbar, for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, and to those around the world, good evening and perhaps good morning. Thank you all for joining us for this panel, The Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health, at the 2022 International Space Medicine Summit. The panelists we are bringing together today really represent different groups who are heavily invested in the advancement of this field, and they are collectively experts in their own domains. So we have Drs. Fogarty and Urquieta Ordóñez from the Baylor College of Medicine, Drs. Reyes and Levan from the NASA Johnson Space Center Clinic, Dr. Rittweger from the German Aerospace Center, and Drs. Kuhn and Van Balen from the NASA Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health team. Spaceflight and the associated training comes with a host of occupational exposures, and it is our goal to, in the next 1 hour and 15 minutes, engage in various topics surrounding this area and discuss things such as what we have seen between short and long-term flight, the strategies taken to monitor this particular group of flyers, the NASA Treat Act, and others. So to get started, I will ask each speaker to briefly introduce themselves and provide some opening remarks, starting with Dr. Jen Fogarty. Dr. Fogarty.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, and thank you to the organizers. Really a pleasure to be here again at ISMS. Hopefully in the near future we get to see each other in person, but I appreciate the virtual platform, and I know we definitely have created some that have a lot more interaction than we've had in the past. So I have had a 17-year history at NASA Johnson Space Center supporting medical operations. And then ultimately, the last 5 years of my career, I was in the Human Research Program and ended as the chief scientist of the NASA Human Research Program. I stepped away in 2021 for what I call my gap year, explored some things in industry, but was recruited back to the space flight and human research world via Baylor College of Medicine, and I am now the Chief Scientific Officer for the Translational Research Institute for Space Health. While we have a very similar charter that the Human Research Program of NASA has, we actually have an advantage in that we're encouraged to be incredibly disruptive and take on a lot more risk with the research that we sponsor and the strategic plans that we make in order to understand what's going on with humans during spaceflight. So we have a broad scope of work that we attack in many different ways. And Dr. Urquieta is going to talk about one of our programs that's incredibly comprehensive, and I think really speaks to the need to have continuous and standardized capability to surveil the humans for change over time, And that is also punctuated by some hypothesis-driven work based on the observations that we've made in the past and via the current data. We have a lot of opportunities that we take with industry and academia to pursue some of the more novel findings to see where they might be applied in the future. So it can be very exploratory work as we move forward in things such as human metabolism and the manipulation of human metabolism to benefit our ability to explore space with some very constrained and extreme conditions, of course. We're always fighting for resources. We're also looking at bioengineered human models, such as tissue chips and organoids that can give us insight into how humans may respond to the extreme environments they're going to be exposed without ever having to expose and risk an individual before they have to go on a mission. So currently we have a portfolio that's also looking at how to create autonomous platforms so that they could be put out, say, on satellite chassis or on the lunar surface and be used as longitudinal tools for observation. But of course, they have a lot of application to precision medicine and can complement individuals as they pursue the exploration of space as well. In addition to that, we also have a very practical approach to meeting the more near-term needs, but allowing us to leverage and learn more about exploration through the Artemis program and the Moon to Mars effort. When we talk about medical architecture, and given my career and my experience, I will say that human research in human spaceflight is never at the exclusion of medical operations. We never know, when you talk about surveillance to me, you're never going to know what you're going to find. And that's the point of doing surveillance. You have to be open to finding new signal and realizing that maybe we lack the ability to interpret it, and that's the gap. So I think it's really important to start to move forward with autonomous healthcare as early as possible in the Artemis missions to learn how we do the correct type of surveillance and how do we really shake out these systems so that the crew can be Earth independent when they will need to be and build the robustness and reliability in these systems as we grow the evidence base. So thank you very much. Those are my opening remarks, and I will hand it over to Dr. Urqueta.
Thank you, Dr. Fogarty. Thank you, Dr. Ronak Shah, Dr. Dunbar, and all the organizers of this ISMS. It's nice to see all of these familiar faces. A little bit of my introduction. My name is Emmanuel Urqueta. I'm a physician by training. I train in emergency medicine, and I also have a couple of years of experience doing aeromedical evacuation in helicopters. For the last almost 6 years, I've been working at the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, TRISH. And in the last couple of years, I've been the Chief Medical Officer. I'm also faculty at Bell College of Medicine in the Department of Emergency Medicine and the Center for Space Medicine. So just to expand a little bit on what Dr. Fogarty was mentioning, I just want to cover some of the general aspects of one of our newest initiatives, the EXPAND program, that some of you might have heard. And this is very important for this to the context of this panel, and we'll see how this also connects and how deliverables to the agency in the context of LSAH that our NASA colleagues will present later in the session, and how we work together with multiple stakeholders. So what is EXPAND? EXPAND is a new platform that Trish has developed to standardize, to collect standardized data in a prospective fashion. Now we work very closely with the commercial spaceflight providers, and as you are very well aware, this is a very different population from your NASA and your agency astronauts. So this research that we implement in these platforms needs to be, number one, low footprint. And we want to collect research, medical, environmental data, and also biosamples. And all of these data sets and samples are stored at Baylor College of Medicine, and the long-term use of this is for investigators that want to do hypothesis-driven research. We have been working closely with NASA, with our colleagues at HRP, to ensure that we are harmonized with what they have developed as standard measures, so that we can compare apples to apples, regardless of the mission duration. Now, what value do we have from this data? So I'm going to cover some of the stakeholders here. First, to the commercial spaceflight providers. Number one, they can improve the experience of their spaceflight participants because they are really their business model. To NASA, to the Artemis program, some of these durations are short duration. We have seen, for example, Inspiration 4, 3 to 4 days. And this is roughly the same duration that we'll see on early Artemis missions on the transit to the moon. So in some aspects, they can be analogs to the Artemis missions. Some of the priority areas for us, like sensory motor adaptations and space motion sickness, are also extremely relevant to Artemis. So we can learn from these populations, and then we can translate the results to the astronaut corps from the government to the government astronauts. Also, from a medical screening and safety perspectives, this is a deliverable to the commercial spaceflight providers. To the agency, edge cases and unknown unknowns. As we know, some of the spaceflight participants are not as healthy as the government astronauts. So we have a very unique opportunity to understand these edge cases and some of the unknown unknowns that will come during these missions. And finally, to the scientific community, we are starting to get a large data set. Just in the last year, we were able to collect data from 9 spaceflight participants. And as we're seeing these private missions, we expect at least 2 or 3 each year. So we are expecting to increase this number significantly over the next few years. Now, there's, of course, some limitations as well. Some of them, as I was mentioning, is really the short duration of these missions. However, in the context of some of the medical conditions, I'm just going to mention an example of SANS. We can collect data that we do not yet have. Most of the data from SANS, for example, is 10 to 15 days, the earliest on the shuttle missions. And these very early missions, we're collecting OCT and some of the same standards as NASA uses to follow up SANS. And we can start seeing these changes even before they manifest as a sign or a symptom on the astronaut. So we have these new opportunities to understand the progression of the disease on the early stages. This is a program that needs to stay nimble and needs to respond to changes. Some of the challenges, as I was mentioning, is working with all the providers. Each of them have their own vehicle, their own mission durations, their own destinations, and ensuring that we can standardize the data that we collect, being agnostic and having a low implementation cost from a training and mass and volume is something that we have been bringing to the space community in general. So these are my opening remarks, and looking forward to discussions in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I would like to move to Dr. David Reyes from the NASA Flight Medicine Clinic.
All right. Good morning, or afternoon, or evening. I'm David Reyes. I am family medicine trained, and I did the aerospace medicine residency at UTMB. I graduated in 2014. After that, I was hired at NASA to work on the exploration medical capability team. And as part of that, we did a lot of work with the integrated medical model, which utilizes quite a bit of LSH data. So that's a good example of that. A fair bit of operational experience. I've been to Star City about 5 times to work with our astronauts that are training there. I've been in Moscow several times. I think I've spent about a year of my life in Russia in the past. Very interesting experience. That's like the other half of conventional pre-commercial spaceflight, if you will. I worked at the MBL quite a bit. Also, more recently, in the past 2 years, I worked on COVID operations and preventive measures for our astronauts, hand in hand with Dr. Shaw, and that was a really fabulous experience. Very interesting. We did a lot of good work on that. And after that, I was hired in April as the Flight Medicine Clinic lead, working under Dr. Levan and on the flight medicine side. And that's been a really great experience. We've started ramping up the LSAH exams in person since the pandemic has waned. And a lot of the astronauts haven't been seen in several years. So they're coming back and they're very, very eager to participate. So that's been great to see. And that's about it in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reyes. Dr. Tim Levan.
Good right at noon, everybody. My name is Dr. Tim Levan. I am the current clinical medical director for the Johnson Space Center Clinic, having taken over for Dr. Shaw when he moved on to his next role and taken over in this rewarding post. The clinic medical director interacts directly with both the LSAH program and we also interact with the TREAT Act, which is essentially the flip side of the LSAH program. The interesting thing about the TREAT Act is this is a piece of legislation enacted in 2017 and that became effective in 2019 that essentially guarantees that astronauts will not be responsible for any medical conditions that developed due to spaceflight. So it's obviously directly informed by the research of the LSAH and the epidemiologic research of our LSAH colleagues. But it's an interesting concept because our astronauts are either generally civil servants or they are military astronauts. And so there are alternate mechanisms for them to be protected from or covered for medical concerns related to their spaceflight service. So the military astronauts are covered through the DoD and VA if the injury or illness is deemed related to their military service with NASA, and then our civil servants would be covered under the Department of the Labor FICA guidelines if it's deemed pursuant to their employment with NASA. The interesting thing is, to date, both of these agencies, both the VA and the Department of Labor, have deferred the decision-making to NASA as far as whether conditions meet the criteria for spaceflight related or occupationally related injuries. So the other mechanism that we have, which is the Treat Act Astronaut Board, which makes the decision about whether something that has been denied by the VA or the Department of the Labor is actually associated. It's effectively, before it gets to the Treat Act Board, we've already had a chance to weigh in on whether something looks like it's spaceflight associated or related. But basically, these have brought up some interesting cases associated with that, and definitely informed our information related to that through the LSAH programs. Also, this is not my first opportunity to work with a longitudinal surveillance project. I just retired from 30 years in the Navy, and one of my responsibilities in the Navy was managing a similar program for repatriated prisoners of war. And at my prior command, we conducted a similar surveillance program for the repatriated prisoners of war of all services, basically doing annual surveillance exams on those individuals as well, to look at the after effects of their incarceration as a prisoner of war. So I'm looking forward to participating in the panel and hope to add some value here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levan. With that, I turn over to Dr. Rittweger from the German Aerospace Center.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, for involving me here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm deeply honored to be part of this panel. I graduated from medical school in Munich as a medical doctor, then specialized in human physiology in the Free University of Berlin, went then to Manchester to learn more about exercise and sports sciences, where I was a professor, and then moved back to Germany to the Institute of Aerospace Medicine in Cologne at the heart of the German Aerospace Center. This institute, as many of you will know, is regularly carrying out bed rest studies, ground-based model studies on behalf of NASA, but also ESA and other agencies. So we do know quite a bit about the space analog and long-term studies. We can do 3 months bed rest, for example. My department is the Department of Muscle and Bone Metabolism, which I'm chairing. And here we dedicate ourselves to mechanics, tissue mechanics of muscles and bones in exercise and disuse. We have a working group on metabolism, and we have a working group on exercise countermeasures. So you can see that we span the entire field of expertise from the mechanics of exercise to what effects it has not only for the working muscles and bones, but also for the entire body. And I think this is in the development of effective countermeasures a crucial step so far in bed rest studies and also in my space studies. We have mostly focused on keeping the bone, keeping the muscle where it was. And, we just looked at functionality of these tissues. We understand more and more that all of these tissues are involved in organismic processes, systemic processes, and they are affecting the body's metabolism, energy metabolism, but also specific metabolism. From the experience in the bed rest studies, we know that small discrepancies, energy surpluses or deficits can accumulate over weeks and months. And, it's a different thing if you have to, as we have to in bed rest studies, keep the body mass or the body percentage fat constant despite the muscle losses. If you take just those composition values, it's often quite difficult to steer the entire process. With regards to potential hazards and consequences of long-term space flight, we haven't any knowledge, I think, of deep space missions. They will be much longer. So any metabolic problems will have potential to accumulate much more. And I think what we need is ways of monitoring cardiometabolic risk in long-term missions. And if we can, and I join here with Dr. Fogarty, if we can find ways of monitoring, where it is going, if people accumulate ectopic fat in crucial organs, then I think it would be possible to close the loop between science and MedOps in that we provide MedOps with facilities of monitoring specifically individual crew members. And I think this is what I wanted to mention in my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ritviger. I will now turn to Dr. Mary Van Balen of the LSAH team at NASA.
Thanks, Ronak. I'm going to kind of break with tradition, and I'm going to introduce myself and my roles and my thoughts kind of along as I talk, because I have kind of a dual role right now that positions me to look at NASA's data sources to address the health risks of human spaceflight and exploration. We also have an opportunity in that to look at long-term health data. And so I do have a few points on longitudinal data collection, its uses, and its importance. My role that this community is most familiar with is the manager of the LSAH, the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health, and the LSDA groups, the Life Sciences Data Archives. And most of you likely know that LSAH encompasses managing and monitoring the crew medical data across their active careers and through retirement. So we start with selection and we collect that data throughout their lives. We also have the Life Sciences Data Archive, which encompasses managing and reusing data from research experiments that crews have participated during the individual's missions. And I think Emmanuel had some really interesting points in the EXPAND database where these two data sources might be collaboratively, comparable and useful. NASA's data has been collected over a 60-year period of time. So we have these combined archives where we have the most comprehensive picture of the individual crew health across their lifetime. And I think that you would get in any other career. For any other type of a career, I kind of started my career as an occupational health professional. And I find this really exciting because even as an occupational health professional, we only have these spot checks on an individual throughout their career. With this astronaut data, we have really opportunities to look at things in a robust longitudinal fashion, both in mission, through the terrestrial parts of their career, and through their life. My most recent role is as the Human System Risk Manager, and I'd like to spend some time talking a few words on the goal of human system risk management and this ability to articulate and track our knowledge on these human system risks to assure that we've gained sufficient knowledge using human spaceflight activities, research advances, and then appropriately using data from terrestrial medicine as well. and that we can then document that and apply it to the evolving human spaceflight programs and to reduce the risk to astronaut crews. NASA's been undergoing a very robust growth in the types of missions that we are supporting and our opportunities to work with the commercial providers. The Human System Risk Board pulls together teams of physicians, researchers, and epidemiologists within the NASA community that are kind of subject matter experts in these areas. And they bring forth all of the evidence contributing to the assessment of these human system risks. So we talked a little bit in this panel and the previous panels about SANS. And so SANS is one of the human system risks. Renal stones is another human system risk. In all, there are 30 human system risks that are evaluated across 8 design reference missions, both for operations and long-term health. And so when you see this matrix or this framework, there are 30 times 8 times 8. There's quite a bit in that of information in those 480 risk assessments. But I have this one talking point that I like to make about the complex nature of the human system risks and its management. Historical data and knowledge gained from all of the data sources, including the LSAH and the LSDA, have to be utilized to perform these assessments and then ultimately inform missions development. One of the previous panels, it was really important. The conversation was about how we inform the commercial providers as well, so that they learn from the evidence base that NASA has as well. While each risk is evaluated independently, we also have to integrate human physiology, and that we need to work towards this integration of human system risk, right? They cannot live in silos. The cardiovascular risk that was talked to briefly by Dr. Winmeyer is important to note that the cardiovascular system is across the entire body. So all risk will be likely impacted physiologically by the cardiovascular system. Bringing the data to bear to understand the human risk of spaceflight is challenging, especially since the international space community has been collecting data over 60 years. Data formats have evolved, medicine and research have evolved. Reuse of this data requires investments in the data harmonization efforts, IT systems that can also enable the use of much more recently developed analytic tools. I think one of the important points in Dr. Urqueda's point is that talking about the expand database is those are measures that are taken for short duration missions with current clinical and medical and research techniques, and using that more current data may actually still also inform NASA about things that we thought we had answered back in our early programs. So the trained epidemiologist in me has to point out that creative scientific thinking combined with advanced analytics capabilities are needed for decision making. Because from a population perspective, the number of individuals that have flown is really small. And this is the classic small n problem. So I encourage the community to use their creative scientific thinking and advanced analytics capabilities to help NASA and the commercial providers solve and understand the human system risks. And kind of my final point is going to be that I am really encouraged with the changing landscape of spaceflight and the expansion of the population of flown individuals. There's a much larger, greater opportunity for collecting more data to better inform the industry, and also looking at that variability to use, as Emmanuel said earlier, look at the edge cases, look at the edge cases in a way that we can also inform our uncertainty in the knowledge that we have gained already due to the small n. And with that, those are my opening remarks, and I look forward to hearing Jessica's and move on to the panel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Balen. Moving over now to Dr. Kuhn, who also works with the LSAH team at NASA. Dr. Kuhn.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Kuhn, and I'm the Deputy Lead to the Lifetime Surveillance of Astronaut Health Group and the Life Sciences Data Archive. Again, thank you for the invitation to speak on this panel today. And since this is my first time speaking to you directly here at ISMS, I can introduce myself a little bit. I came to NASA with a bit of a varied background with experience in business, winemaking, foliar pathology, epidemiology, and public health. My Ph.D. is in nutrition sciences. And my dissertation research was focused in skeletal physiology and how it changes in spaceflight and with disuse. Since Mary nicely introduced the LSH and LSDA teams, I'll just skip ahead really quick to a few things that I wanted to briefly highlight today relating to occupational surveillance and long-term health. So the first of which is the loss of data that occurred between 2020 and 2022 when we weren't able to bring the former crew members to JSC for the annual preventative exams. We all know a lot can happen in 2 years, and for monitoring long-term health, it's really important to start capturing that data again. And as Drs. Reyes and Levan mentioned earlier, earlier this summer, we started re-engaging with the former NASA crew members to schedule exams again, so we can hope to close that data gap this year. The next thing that I wanted to briefly mention is one of our communication products for the NASA crew is the LSH newsletter that highlights a variety of projects, including progress on our database and data analytics platform that we call Impala, occupational surveillance, and long-term health projects. The fall issue is actually just sent out to active and former crew. For those of you in the audience today, we would really love to have your feedback on our new design. For others in the audience, we do publish those newsletters on a public website that I can somehow provide. I don't know if I can provide a link like in the chat or something. If people are interested, I can figure that out. But we do publish those newsletters on a public website. Again, so just please note that we did just migrate to a new platform and website. So the fall newsletter is not posted yet, but it should be there within a couple of weeks. But all of our historical newsletters are on that site as well. The last thing that I wanted to just briefly mention is a project that was led by our senior epidemiologist, Jackie Charvat, that was recently published. So this project was a collaboration with the Cooper Institute in Dallas, who has a longitudinal study that contains data from a healthy population from their preventative medicine clinic. The study focused on the risk of cardiovascular disease, and while there were some physical fitness differences between the two cohorts, no major clinical differences were seen. Ultimately, this was an important project for not only the cardiovascular disease comparison, but also in finding a comparable cohort to our astronaut corps, since doing so has been a big challenge for several years. We also have a number of other exciting projects happening this year, including publishing more grouped health and demographic data. Just to touch on something that Mike Barrett said in the previous panel, but I think I will just hand it back over to Dr. Shauna and look forward to the discussion that we have. Thank you.
Thank you much. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Dr. Kuhn. So at this point, we will shift over to the Q&A, chat, etc., and I'll be monitoring those. And there was a comment here saying, yes, Dr. Kuhn, please post a link to the webpage for public posting of the LSH newsletter. So with that, I am going to, in the next format, toss out some questions. I will identify one person to start, and then let's see how the chips fall. So I'll start with you, Dr. Urqueta Ordóñez. Can you share with us some of your thoughts on how to stratify what specifically we need to monitor in spaceflight participants, given the fact that the individual risk profiles will be different based on the mission flown?
Yeah, that's a really good thought. So in our case, we're interested on collecting data that is not necessarily hypothesis driven. So we go back to the baseline and to the physiologic changes that we know happen, especially during these early missions, right? Like, for example, we're not interested necessarily in bone or muscle loss because these are, up to 2 weeks so far. We have seen the commercial spaceflight missions. Most of them have been just a few days, 3 to 5 days. So we try to focus on what we know from a physiologic perspective that we will likely see some change. So we try to collect a lot of physiologic parameters with the smallest footprint devices, heart rate, SpO2, EKG, things that we expect to see some change. Some of the others are looking at, as Mary was mentioning, some data that we were not able to collect in the past, but we think it could bring some value to the understanding of some conditions like SANS. So in the case of SANS, we are mirroring the MED-B 1.10 protocol. So we're doing these pre and post flight so that we can understand if there's some changes in OCT or other of these measures that we didn't catch earlier in previous missions. So and this is a very evolving field, right? We're seeing differences every day. We're also working with some of the suborbital companies, not necessarily because we're interested in the suborbital capabilities at this point, but they're also thinking on developing low Earth orbit destinations and some human landers for the surface of the moon. And from a high throughput perspective, these are the ones that are really flying a lot of people these days, right? So what can we understand from these really, really short duration exposures, but from a high throughput fashion? So I hope that answered a little bit of the question, but short answer, it's always an evolving field.
No, thank you very much. Do any of the panelists have something else to add? Oh, Dr. Rittviger. You're muted, sir.
Excuse me. Just out of interest, Dr. Ordonez, when we do bed rest studies, we pay great attention to standardization of data acquisition. So we know that, most of the blood-derived measurements that we take, they depend heavily on what kind of exercise activities people have had in the past couple of days, and also their nutrition. So I wonder what your strategy is, to improve your data set by having standardized conditions under which these samples are obtained.
Yeah, so from a sample collection perspective, and I can elaborate a little bit more from a biosamples perspective, what we are collecting. So we're collecting blood, saliva, urine, stool swabs, and skin swabs. And we do whole genome sequencing and RNA sequencing. So we do 3 collections pre-flight to obtain a baseline, and then 3 collections post-flight. All of these are analyzed and processed at the Human Genome Sequencing Center at Baylor College of Medicine. And again, this is the way that we are implementing this is not a hypothesis-driven data collection. So the main goal of this is to offer these data sets and these samples to investigators like yourself, that then you could come up with a hypothesis, ask for the samples, and then perform your analysis.
If I could add real quickly onto that, Emmanuel, the idea, Jorn, is that we realize, essentially, even in the commercial space, like it's more field research than laboratory quality, right? It's real life. It's happening. There's an operation. There's people going up there for various reasons, including tourism, and want to enjoy it. You're going to have their morning coffee or things that, aspects that typically we would want to heavily control. So the metadata, people documenting around the sample collection, what's going on, so that we can go back and reflect on that when the sample analysis occurs, that you can pick up why there might be deviations that don't look, what we would expect. So we're trying to push toward, and to Emmanuel's point, growing it in a way that it's acceptable to the community in terms of footprint, and what you're asking from these subjects is deep phenotyping, getting as many levels of sample coming out from functional to molecular, in ways that are as unobtrusive and non-invasive as possible, and have them be available for people to query and do their analysis with later. But there are some active efforts. We realize some of the sample can be turned into data essentially immediately to preserve quality. But that's where our standardization and what Emmanuel was discussing, like working with the Human Genome Center at Baylor College of Medicine, having protocols for them when people do consent to it, like these are our expectations. And then of course we're asked, were our expectations met? So it's that balance of doing a little bit more of a field quality research versus the laboratory control that you can get in bed rest. But helping people understand what that means with the interpretation limitations of the data.
Dr. Van Balen?
I actually have I'm going to pivot just a little bit. I have a little bit different point to some of the stuff that Emmanuel was talking about towards the end with his answer. and kind of a food for thought perspective, when we talk about the short duration flights or the suborbital flights that you were mentioning, Emmanuel, when we think about longitudinal data and data collection, I'm often struck by the pilots of these vehicles and that their exposure profile looks unlike anything else when you've got a repeated routine suborbital set of exposures where we don't have that type of data, and the importance of that type of collection to inform repeated exposures and to see what we can learn about the constant accommodation that occurs in spaceflight. So occupationally, I have regularly thought that that was an interesting point that we have not explored as a community.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we designed the program, we thought that at one point there would be in the commercial space flight one person that would fly twice, and we're just in the really second year of really this really increase of civilians flying to space, and we already have one civilian that is doing a second mission. Jared Isaacman flew in Inspiration 4, and we're working with him on Polaris Dawn already. So it is very interesting, those multiple exposures, the same individual through multiple exposures. In this case, they're going to do a spacewalk. They're going to be exposed to a lot of environmental changes that we didn't see on the first mission. So I think these unique cases of multiple time flyers are going to bring very, very interesting information. I completely agree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Excuse me. The chat is becoming very active, so I'm going to hold back on the pre-positioned questions I have and jump over to the chat here. So first question is this, and this is an open forum now. There is concern regarding space radiation and long-term cancer risk. How are we screening at the annual exams for common and uncommon cancers in our flown astronauts? And I will turn to either Dr. Levan or Dr. Reyes to open on the floor here.
I can start on that one. So there's different standards that are set. There's standards for selection and standards for flight certification, and then different standards when you get assigned to a mission. So those are the Med A's and the Med B's, as they're called at NASA. And those documents specify certain imaging studies that are collected, such as, I'm looking at the Med A here. So there's total colonoscopy, MRI of brain, carotid ultrasound, et cetera. So various imaging studies that are collected, and also labs that we collect. And so astronauts also have yearly exams where things are done. So there's a certain periodic frequency to the scans, like, for example, total abdominal ultrasound every 3 years, for example, and things like that, and as well as labs. And as far as, if they're assigned, there's additional, the Med B's apply then. That's a lot of our data collection and science happens through the Med B's. And so additional studies are also done through those. And one of them would be like a renal ultrasound, which is to look at stones, but we often catch other things as well, like renal cysts and things. And then if an astronaut has a pre-existing risk or pre-existing risk factors for cancer, they get additional, anything that's relevant, like, yearly skin exams to whatever kind of cancer markers they may need. And as far as, retired astronauts, we're not really their primary care anymore. We do a lot of things for them, and we do a pretty complete exam, but that's left up to their PCP. And of course, if we see anything, we bring that to their attention. And I'm sure Dr. Levan may have more to add. Thank you.
If I could hone the question just a little bit, I think the focus or the heart of the question is looking at what are we doing for those who are no longer active in the Corps, but more so retired or former astronauts. What are we doing to screen these individuals based upon what we have learned about space radiation?
Yeah, so Ronak, I'll add to that. So the LSAH surveillance exam, one of the main functions of the exam, and I can defer this to my LSAH colleagues as well to allow them to expand on this a little bit, but we are focusing on the long-term effects of spaceflight as opposed to, so this is much more of a surveillance exam than it is a fitness for duty or a fitness to fly exam at this point. So the focus really has shifted. Historically, some of the focus of the LSAH exam has been on the conditions that we've already identified, things like SANS. So some of the LSAH exam is very heavy in the eye area, but there are a number of candidates coming in, and we certainly do everything we can to obtain the routine surveillance labs that the astronauts would be having through their normal healthcare process. But we have proposed and are debating adding things like mammography, colonoscopy, and other cancer markers to the LSAH exam going forward. And I would reiterate what Dr. Reyes said, and that is that even for the active astronauts, we are doing parts of the Med A and Med B are obviously focused on their fitness to perform, to perform the mission, the space mission, but other parts of it are focused on early identification of any problems that may have arisen even before they've left the astronaut corps. So I don't think that we're, that it's a true dichotomy. I think that there's a spectrum here as for our active astronauts, we're doing both fitness for duty and surveillance examination of them. And then on the, once they transition to the retired roles, then their focus is much more obviously surveillance and longitudinal health assessment. But I can see there's some additional comments ready to go here.
Thank you, Dr. Levan.
I think Dr. Van Balen had some thoughts as well.
Dr. Van Balen, do you have anything further to add? Dr. Van Balen, can you hear us?
I think the point I would add, can you, I'm apparently at service here on site. Is that better?
No, it is not. We're having a difficult time with your audio.
I am on site, so I'm doing the best I can from an audio perspective. Is it any better?
It's yes, it is a little bit better. Go ahead.
Okay. Looks like the point I think I was going to add, and I think it's an important part of the LSAH exam, is the individual provider's conversation that they have with the former astronaut, where they talk through those primary care activities or testing or conditions that they've been undergoing. And the LSAH team makes a very concerted effort to obtain those primary care records and any specialist records. And so the database has a record of that personal history of that former astronaut as well, although the existing exam is, again, more of a surveillance exam. And so I wanted to talk to the importance of that provider in the clinic with the former astronaut conversation, and addressing then any treatment opportunities or things that the astronaut might not need. And I think that's an important part of the exam that Dr. Levan didn't quite touch on, but I see it from the data side.
Thank you. Appreciate that input. Are there any further comments on this question? Because we have more. Okay, so let's go to the next question. It's a good one. Autopsies are performed rarely these days, but could yield tremendously valuable data on long-term health effects in former space flyers, especially an Apollo-era crew. Are there any discussions within NASA, specifically LSAH or HRP, to encourage retired crew members to sign prospective consenting and for NASA to cover the cost of what might be considered, quote, optional autopsies?
Dr. Shaw, I can take this, and the answer is yes. Actually, there is a whole policy and process for obtaining autopsies on our former astronauts that die of essentially natural causes, or die of non-occupational related injuries. And in fact, we do have a program to absorb the costs. It's a two-prong approach. The first is that we utilize the Armed Forces Medical Examiner system to perform the autopsies, and we're in constant dialogue with AFMES in terms of what components we would like them to focus on in the autopsy. So, for example, we can specify, samples of cornea or samples of retina or samples of cardiac muscle, samples of bone, and they will make sure to obtain those specific samples as they perform the exam. The other component of that, and this falls under the TREAT Act, which allows us to gather data, is that we are able to pay for really then the only cost that would be pursuant to the autopsy, which would be transportation to the site of the autopsy. And so we have the ability to basically transport remains of the astronauts to the autopsy facility, whether it's Dover or San Antonio, and then actually provide return of the remains to the funeral home for their, for the follow-on care. So we are reaching out, and as the population ages, we are trying to educate them more and more about the value of agreeing to an autopsy. And then we do reach out to families as well in the, immediately post the time immediately after death to try to encourage them to allow the autopsy as well, and make sure that they're on board with that. But again, there is a comprehensive process right now, and we're continuing to refine that process on a monthly basis. Over.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question from the same individual that says, very interesting, Dr. Levan. Has any autopsy yet occurred under the system that you have described?
Yes, we've actually had, I believe, 3 astronauts that underwent the Armed Forces Medical Examiner autopsies. And currently, the tissue specimens are maintained there, but ultimately we are developing a tissue bank so that we'll hopefully be able to maintain preserved tissue samples at the lab at NASA going forward. Over.
Let me add a little to that. So we've had some crew that are retired, and they have a surgery of some sort, and they donate, the tissue. Like if somebody has a hip replacement, for instance, they asked to donate the bone to NASA, and so we've actually accepted a few of those. So that's another sort of living autopsy, if you will. So that's happened, and we have those in storage. Over.
Copy. Thank you, Dr. Reyes, and thank you, Dr. Levan. Do the panelists have anything further to add to this topic? Okay. The next one is more of a comment, and it says, commercial providers are looking to fly individuals with significant medical problems, some of which have been previously cleared for flight on ISS, but largely unpublished in the literature. Crew confidentiality is a concern, to be sure, but there are ways to publish case reports in a de-attributed way. I would like to see NASA and the international space medicine community step up your efforts to publish clinical reports so the whole field can truly benefit from the lessons learned from the ISS. So this is a comment, but I would like to hear some comments back. And I'll again open the floor. Dr. Fogarty.
Yeah, I mean, can't help but agree with the statement. We have discussed this, that it's been put out in some presentations in public forums, as a list of conditions that have been flown, I think, which has been helpful contextually, but not broadly disseminated and really hard to interpret at times. So it would be helpful on the end of commercial spaceflight and working with commercial spaceflight, platforms and their flyers, and I'll ask Dr. Urqueta to chime in. When going through the consenting process and the idea of data transfer, these people realize very early on that they are now ends of one, right? Just like we often talk about spaceflight, you have 600 ends of one almost. Lots of challenges there, small populations, relatively speaking, sometimes ultra small, especially when you want to start saying sex differences or something along the lines of, an ethnic impact. So we try to be very clear, and we have received nothing but positive feedback. Now, clearly, you have to be very careful when you go to the publication phase and the implications of what you're going to publish, so that the relationship, with the person being exposed in the material has to understand what the publication is and what it means. And then, of course, anytime we get into molecular work, meaning more like genomic, the implications for them and others, their relatives, has to be addressed. So we have also brought in, as NASA did during the twin study, a genetic counselor, so that they feel fully informed. But it is very possible. And even, when we've interacted with crew members in the past, that a lot of data can come out in biographies and autobiographies. So they're not really against it, but I think having to be proactive with the discussion about why and when it gets published, it makes it more possible.
Thank you. Dr. Kuhn, I know you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to add that, so generally speaking, I think we agree now is an important time to get more information out there for other people to really learn from and be aware of. In the last year, we have stood up new processes for helping to publish things like occupational surveillance, in addition to research studies, which has been a process that's been in existence for some time. Case studies specifically on, less than 5 individuals is a bit more challenging, but I'll say that the LSAH group requires attributability reviews that we perform on any of these such publications. So we help ensure whoever is publishing this information can really be doing so in a way that protects our crew. And so really I wanted to speak on the processes that we've stood up in the last year, but also we're looking at trying to publish more information to the general public about, again, as I mentioned earlier, some grouped demographic and health information to, again, try to get more out there. And we have some plans for communication forthcoming this year.
Thank you. Dr. Guerra Ordonez.
Yeah, I think this is something extremely relevant. And this goes back to the edge cases that I was mentioning at the beginning, right? And we'll start seeing more of this in commercial spaceflight. Unique situations that, the flight surgeons were able to find some waivers and some medical treatment to make these folks go into space. And there is a lot of precedent with this. During the really first civilian missions to ISS, there's a bunch of publications from Dr. Richard Jennings with some of the spaceflight participants that actually the participants are co-authors on these case reports in peer-reviewed journals, and they have been pretty open on some of the medical conditions that they had to treat to make them flyable. There's some cases of a giant hepatic hemangioma that needed to be resected to make this person flyable. And, what we have seen, at least from the commercial spaceflight arena, is that the spaceflight participants are pretty open to participate in these publications. And, they feel part of the science on, having their name in a publication. And, I think this is something extremely useful, and we're in a really good shape to start getting these publications to the scientific and the medical community.
Thank you. Dr. Levan.
Yeah, I'll just add and reiterate, again, we're looking at very small ends, and the decisions to fly tend to be on a, very much on a case-by-case basis. And so while the case reports are informative, I think it's imperative that we continue to pursue the epidemiologic data that's coming out of the LSAH program, so that we can kind of look at the long-term sequelae. Because we flew one person with a condition and they did okay on that flight does not necessarily validate that condition is safe for all people in all settings and all flights. And so we need to be cautious about taking a case report and generalizing it to all populations and all data. And again, I think that just emphasizes the importance of the LSAH as opposed to the the case reports. But that was basically my comment. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much for that input. Dr. Ritviger.
Yes, of course. I join in with and chime with the former speakers. In my department, we always struggle to find people who write things. So we have a lot of data. The same may be true for this case. And so I hope I don't sound negative now, but if I wonder which would be the pieces of information that are most relevant, is actually where things probably didn't work out as they were thought to work. So it's always more informative to be alarmed by something that wasn't going as it was expected than whenever everything went well. So that's just I hope this doesn't sound too negative.
No.
But the point I would add, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in real quick, Veronica. The point I would add to what Jorn is saying is that's also sometimes the most difficult things where it went well. That is very hard to actually communicate that or get that accepted. Usually it's the problems that are more easily accepted as a case study, et cetera. So that is one of the challenges in publication as well. So I was going to compare and contrast with his points.
Thank you, Dr. Van Balen. Go ahead.
A slight addition. So a lot of publications may originate with the flight surgeon cadre at NASA, and a lot of them are very operationally oriented. So not a lot of them publish. Some publish a lot, and others don't have it as a priority. So that's a little bit of the issue, at least on the medical side. So I just want to mention that.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears and put forth another question, and that is, what are your thoughts on how we should be approaching claims for cancer from long-duration missions as it relates to the Treat Astronauts Act? And I'm going to start with either Dr. Levan or Dr. Reyes.
That's probably something Dr. Levan can answer better. But I think that radiation or cancer associated found in a long duration flyer is occupational until proven otherwise. I think there's some things that are very clearly related to spaceflight, like SANS and increased radiation exposure and so forth. So I would lean towards that.
Dr. Levan.
Hey, I'm sorry. I had a quick call come in. I can get back to you guys in a second. I apologize.
Okay. Dr. Van Balen, do you have thoughts on this particular topic?
I think cancer as a disease entity is an interesting one. Cancer is not one disease, right? It's many diseases. And so there's struggles with a lot of confounding exposure and information that goes with it over the lifetime of the individual. Not all cancers are related to, say, radiation exposure. They're related, and they're related to other things that are just part of the normal aging process. And so that makes the entire entity of determining whether or not this multitude of diseases, and I can confidently say there are 35 known different cancers that have been seen in the former astronaut and former astronaut population. And so the evidence for any one of those diseases is really challenging when you look at the full lifetime of an aging human. And so I think there's a lot of challenges there in relating it to radiation exposure.
I have a question.
It wasn't very eloquently said, but yes?
Great. Yes, ma'am. So how would you make a distinction between short duration shuttle flyers and, say, somebody who's done, one or two ISS tours, several months, years, so forth?
I think the agency has the ability and modeling to calculate, just as other external agencies do, the probability of causation. If it is a known radiogenic cancer. We have that ability to do that. And so I would lean towards that modeling over just a broad statement of it's occupationally related until proven otherwise. And I'm kind of using your words to say it's not necessarily just the exposure from radiation. There could be all other things to be taken into account there, and that we do have a modeling capability at the agency to look at the probability of causation for the radiogenic cancers. The other cancers, it's even more challenging because we don't know how to look at all of the different exposure variables. Is that a fair answer, Dave?
I think it's a fair answer, but you didn't ask me, Dr. Van Bellen.
I was answering his question. I think it's a fair band. Go ahead. So.
Dr. Fogarty has her hand up.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad Mary said the right word, which is probability. So, and going back to epidemiology, and this is not a criticism in any way, because it's an amazing tool, but it takes a lot of data and it takes a lot of time, right? So we've been talking about the struggle of using epidemiological methodologies, which with such a small n. So with the emergence of some other precision tools that you could use to generate some information about an individual's susceptibility based on probabilities, and starting to figure out how to test like an induction study where an environmental exposure could actually induce an outcome with a certain genomic background. And this is where the tissue chips organoids come in to allow you to take someone's cells so that you have the baseline genomics and do some of these studies, see if you can actually elicit this outcome and repeat it over many iterations. The other fact is it is a multifactorial process, almost always. It's never a single contributor. So trying to ferret that out. And I do agree with the agency's position about the default setting, that you should be conservative because it is a pretty extreme environment, especially for those who go on long duration exposures. But you can't rule out a 2-week mission with an environmental exposure as not being an inductive state. So you're trying to use a bunch of different data to come to some reasonable conclusion, right? And have a process for making that decision. And you don't want to be, as the lawyers say, arbitrary or capricious about it. To Mary's point, what the rest of the organization that doesn't study space radiation specifically is looking at how to quantify the role of these other stressors, either individually or in concert, that they also could be driving in an induction event. And you see this in other environments, as Mary was alluding to. So when we parallel what goes on in spaceflight with what goes on at the Antarctic because of isolation and confinement and psychological stress, that physiologically you can induce that just by your own body's, ability to manage stress, which can go pathologic. Also, the deficit of the immune system is another one that, it's not an induction event as much as it is the lack of a prevention capability. That if your immune system isn't robust enough to pick off early cancer cells, and you end up getting cancer manifested that was already present, is not the lack of a good immune system to fight off cancer equally as a contributor as having an induction event like DNA damage from radiation exposure. So, that's where these are kind of the holy grail efforts of understanding the human in any extreme environment when you cause a problem. How much did we change someone's future state with these exposures? And could we have predicted it, prevented it, or mitigated it, early, which goes back to the questions about early detection and using surveillance. But what are the signals? Do we know how to find them? And the evidence base growing out of, whether it be physiological measures during bed rest, could that help us understand what biomarkers are for something like the fluid shifts, or isolation and confinement in HERA or NEK, are there those telling us in isolating psychological impacts, and what are those biomarkers and stressors and how do they manifest? So it's going to take some of this complex modeling Mary was referring to that looks at things other than space radiation to start helping us get insights into how we're shifting the probability of the natural course of someone's health over time. And when does someone say that this event was so significant that we altered the course of their health and are therefore responsible for the outcome? And that's true for commercial space as well, even in a 3 to 5 day mission. Sometimes you have set off a chain of events with that exposure. And that's what Emmanuel was referring to, that we're trying to standardize it and map to things so that we can very much understand what we're starting off that we see in people who went for long missions. maybe it all starts in the first 3 to 5 days. Maybe it doesn't take 6 months of exposure to get there. Sometimes maybe it does. So I think it's an ongoing effort, but very complex, and I appreciate everybody who's working on it for sure.
I have one final question as we're approaching the close of the hour. There's a comment here regarding autopsies again. Dr. Levan, see if I can structure the question here. Can you please comment on what has been or what will be done by NASA to reach out to former crew members regarding their interest in participating in this autopsy program, or to give them information about it?
Good question. That's certainly something that we would utilize the LSAH newsletter to publicize and encourage. And then we do reach out with invitations, annually to all of the astronauts to come in, or to all the former astronauts to come in for their surveillance exams. And we can certainly look at developing a process to reach out through the same lists to offer them the opportunity to sign up and kind of pre-register for the autopsy process, or let their interest be known. But right now, I think the main means of communication with the former astronauts is the LSAH newsletter, and we're certainly hoping that they are reading through that and getting the information. And we have discussed that program in the newsletter in the past.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Levan. Well, with that, to all of our panelists and all of our listeners, we have approached the close of the hour. And earlier when we opened, we talked about how the panelists that we are bringing together today for the International Space Medicine Summit really do represent different groups who collectively are experts in their own domains, but really believe in a common goal and a common vision here. So to all of the panelists, I wish to say thank you very much for the content you've provided over the past 1 hour and 15 minutes, and really for lending and being generous with your time for the group here. So thank you very much, all, and I wish you a wonderful day, evening, afternoon. Take care.